The restaurant looked exactly the way a family celebration was supposed to look. Soft lights, linen tablecloths, the sound of waves brushing against the dock outside steady and reassuring. People laughed easily, glasses clinked. From the outside, nothing about that night suggested danger. Then my name was called. Not privately, not gently, out loud into a microphone carried across a room full of people who shared my last name or pretended to. My father's voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. It landed flat and confident the way facts are delivered when no one expects them to be questioned. He said I had stolen their retirement savings. My mother followed calm and composed, explaining that they could no longer protect me from the truth. Phones lifted before I could breathe. Someone whispered. Someone else started recording. I remember thinking how quickly a room decides who you are. I said I hadn't taken anything. My father struck the table and told me not to lie here. That was the moment I understood this wasn't an argument. It was a verdict. And it had already been agreed on without me. If you're listening right now, take a moment and tell me where you are in the world and what time it is for you. I read every comment. And if stories like this matter to you, quiet truths, spoken carefully, consider subscribing. I'm grateful you're here. Before that night, I would have told you my childhood was stable. Not warm exactly, but orderly, predictable. The kind of life people pointed to when they wanted an example of things done right. We lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Charleston, the kind where lawns were trimmed on schedule and nothing important ever seemed to happen in public. I learned early that being easy was the safest way to belong. I did well in school. I followed instructions. I learned how to read the room before I spoke, and how to stop talking before anyone felt uncomfortable. My parents praised that about me. They called it maturity, responsibility. They liked telling people I was self-sufficient as if that quality had appeared on its own. My father, Thomas Cross, worked as a financial advisor. People trusted him instinctively. He had the voice for it, calm, measured, never rushed. At home, that same voice decided everything: budgets, schedules, priorities, what was reasonable to want, and what was considered unnecessary. He didn't yell, he didn't need to. His certainty filled the space instead. My mother, Margaret, cared less about numbers and more about appearances. She remembered names, birthdays, social hierarchies. She knew exactly how our family should look from the outside and spent most of her energy making sure nothing disrupted that image. Discomfort was acceptable. Messiness was not. When I was 12, they told me we were adopting a little girl. Lena was 5, quiet, big-eyed. She clung to my mother's hand when they brought her home like she was afraid the floor might give way beneath her. I remember standing in the doorway of what had been my room, watching my parents explain gently, proudly, that I would be moving downstairs. Just temporarily, they said. Until we figured things out. I nodded. I always nodded. What they didn't say was that temporarily would become permanent in ways that never needed to be discussed. Lena needed stability. Lena needed reassurance. Lena had already been through enough. Those sentences floated around our house like unspoken laws. And because I was older, because I understood, because I was capable, I adjusted. I gave up space first, then time, then attention. Eventually, I gave up being asked how I felt at all. I told myself that love meant making room. That family was about absorbing inconvenience quietly so no one else had to. When Lena cried, I stepped back. When she needed help with school, I stayed up late with her homework after finishing my own. When my parents worried aloud about her adjustment, I kept my concerns to myself. No one asked me to. That was the part I would realize much later. As we got older, the imbalance became more subtle. Lena struggled in ways that required explanation, missed classes, impulsive decisions, emotional swings. My parents leaned in, protective and patient. When I struggled, it was framed differently. I was tired because I worked too much, stressed because I expected too much from myself. The solution was always the same: endure quietly. By the time I moved out, I believed that pattern was proof of trust. They didn't worry about me because I was reliable. They didn't check in because they knew I could handle things. That was the story I told myself whenever something felt off. Even as an adult, I stayed careful. I kept my finances clean. I never borrowed money. I never asked for help. When my father talked about investments or retirement planning, I listened politely and didn't offer opinions. It wasn't my lane. So when the invitations went out for my parents' 35th anniversary dinner, I didn't hesitate to attend. I bought a modest dress. I arrived early. I smiled at the right moments. I thought I was doing everything right. Looking back, what unsettles me most is not that they accused me later, but that nothing in my past had prepared me to defend myself. I had spent my whole life being agreeable, believing that if I stayed consistent enough, reasonable enough, the ground beneath me would stay solid. I believed loyalty worked both ways, even when it was uneven. I believed silence would protect me. Sitting in that restaurant before my name was called, I remember watching my parents across the table, my father laughing easily with relatives, my mother adjusting the placement of a centerpiece, her eyes scanning the room. Lena sat between them, her shoulders tight, her smile brittle. I noticed it, but I didn't question it. I had learned not to. If someone had asked me then whether my family would ever turn on me, I would have said no, without hesitation. Not because we were especially close, but because I believed history counted for something. That years of compliance added up to safety. I didn't yet understand how easily a family can rewrite its own past when it needs a scapegoat. What happened after the dinner unfolded quietly, the way things do when decisions have already been made. There was no confrontation in the parking lot. No raised voices as people drifted toward their cars. My parents hugged guests. Lena avoided my eyes. Someone touched my arm and said, "I'm sure this will get sorted out." I nodded because that was what I'd always done when something didn't make sense yet. By the time I drove home, my phone had stopped working. At first, I thought it was a service issue. Then my banking app refused my login. Then a notification appeared, brief, impersonal, informing me that my account access had been temporarily restricted. I sat in my car for a long moment, engine still running, watching the screen, like it might change its mind. I told myself there had been a mistake. The house I rented was only 15 minutes away, but when I pulled into the driveway, something felt off. The porch light was on, brighter than usual. As I walked closer, I saw the deadbolt glinting under the light new metal where old brass used to be. I tried my key anyway. It didn't fit. I stood there longer than I should have, testing it again, as if the door might remember me. Then I heard movement inside. Footsteps. The scrape of something being dragged. The door opened just wide enough for my father to step out. He didn't ask why I was there. He didn't ask if I was okay. He carried a large black trash bag in both hands and dropped it onto the porch between us. It landed with a soft, uneven thud. "These are your things," he said. "Take them and go." I remember noticing how calm he looked. Not angry. Not conflicted. Settled. I asked what was happening. I asked why my accounts were locked. I asked why my phone wasn't working. The questions came out in the wrong order, tumbling over each other, but he didn't interrupt. "You know exactly what you did," he said when I finished. "We've confirmed it." Confirmed. As if my life had already been audited and closed. He told me I had forged his signature, that I had withdrawn $72,000 from their retirement account over several months, that the bank had records, that he had been generous not to involve the police yet. I said I hadn't taken anything. I said I'd never even accessed those accounts. I said there had to be proof, timestamp, security logs, something. He shook his head slowly, like I was missing the obvious. "Don't make this harder," he said. "You've embarrassed us enough. My mother appeared behind him, then standing just inside the doorway. She didn't look at me. She stared past my shoulder as if the street were more interesting than my face. When I asked her to say something, to explain, to clarify, she pressed her lips together and said, "We can't keep protecting you." Protecting me from what she didn't say. Lena stood behind them, half hidden in the hallway. Her eyes flicked toward mine for a second, then away. She hugged her arms around herself, rocking slightly on her heels. I waited for her to speak, to say this was wrong, to say she knew I wouldn't do that. She said nothing. My father stepped back, hand already on the door. "You're not welcome here anymore," he said. "Not until you take responsibility." The door closed. The lock slid into place. I heard the click clearly. I sat on the porch beside the trash bag until the porch light turned off automatically. When I finally opened it, I found clothes folded without care. Old shoes. A photo album missing its cover. Nothing sentimental. Nothing irreplaceable. It felt deliberate, like another message I wasn't supposed to argue with. That night, I slept in my car. I parked 2 streets away where the houses all looked similar enough that no one would notice me sitting there. I reclined the seat and wrapped myself in a jacket, listening to the tick of the engine cooling down. My phone was useless. I couldn't call anyone. I couldn't prove anything. I couldn't even distract myself. What kept replaying wasn't the accusation itself, but how efficiently I had been removed. By morning, emails had already started circulating. At work, my supervisor asked to speak with me privately. He didn't accuse me directly. He didn't have to. He said there had been concerns raised and that it might be best if I took some time away while things were clarified. I never went back. Friends stopped responding to messages I sent from borrowed phones. A landlord canceled a viewing after a background check flagged financial irregularities. Even casual conversations shifted when my name came up. People grew careful, curious in a way that felt dangerous. What I hadn't expected was how complete the silence would be. No one asked me to explain. No one wanted details. The story had already found its shape, and it didn't need my voice to fill in the gaps. That was when I understood that I hadn't just been accused of something. I had been erased, and the people who knew me best had helped do it without hesitation. The first few days blurred together in a way that made time feel unreliable. I slept in my car in short stretches, waking whenever someone walked past or headlights swept across the windshield. I learned which parking lots were safer than others, which neighborhoods stayed quiet until morning, which ones drew attention too quickly. I brushed my teeth in gas station bathrooms and washed my face in sinks that smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. Every movement felt provisional, like I was borrowing space I didn't deserve. I kept telling myself this was temporary, that once the misunderstanding cleared, I'd go home, that my parents would calm down. That reason would reassert itself. I repeated those thoughts like instructions, even as the days passed without a single message from them. I still had my job technically. At least I thought I did. I showed up on the 3rd morning wearing the same clothes I'd slept in, hoping no one would notice. My supervisor called me into his office before I reached my desk. He spoke carefully, using phrases that sounded rehearsed. Reputational concerns, ongoing situation, company policy. He said it would be best if I stepped away indefinitely while things were sorted out. He didn't meet my eyes when he said it. I packed my things into a cardboard box someone had already prepared. When I walked out, no one asked where I was going. Without work, the days stretched wider and emptier. I spent hours sitting in my car, scrolling through old photos on my phone before the battery died completely. I rationed food without thinking about it, buying whatever was cheapest and filling enough to keep the hunger dull rather than gone. A loaf of white bread, peanut butter, bottled water. I learned how quickly dignity erodes when survival becomes logistical. I joined a gym I couldn't really afford because it gave me access to showers. I went late at night when fewer people were around. I stood under the hot water longer than necessary, letting it hit my shoulders until my hands wrinkled, because it was the only place I felt temporarily unseen. I practiced looking normal again in the mirror, afterward, smoothing my hair, steadying my expression. I didn't want my reflection to give anything away. At night, I watched the video from the anniversary dinner over and over. Someone had posted it online. It had been shared more times than I could count. The comments were worse than the accusations themselves. Speculation, certainty, moral outrage built on nothing but a few clipped sentences and my frozen face. I tried not to read them. I failed every time. What unsettled me most wasn't the cruelty. It was how quickly people decided they knew who I was. Friends stopped answering messages. Some blocked me outright. Others sent brief, uncomfortable replies before disappearing. One landlord canceled a showing after running my name through a database. Another asked if I had family who could vouch for me. I didn't know how to answer that without sounding unhinged. Each small rejection stacked onto the last until I stopped reaching out at all. There were moments, quiet, unexpected ones, when the reality of it all would hit me sideways. Sitting in traffic, watching families load groceries into their trunks. Standing in line at a pharmacy, overhearing someone complain about their parents calling too often. Those scenes made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain to myself. I felt detached from my own life, like I was observing someone else's collapse from a distance that offered no protection. No one ever hit me. No one shouted insults to my face. But every day, something essential was taken away. Stability, trust, the assumption of innocence. I began to move through the world cautiously, measuring my words, my posture, my presence. I didn't want to give anyone another reason to look twice. I started parking near a public library during the day, using the free internet to search for work I could do without references. Most applications went unanswered. Some required background checks I knew I wouldn't pass. Others asked for emergency contacts. I left that field blank. At night, alone in the car, I replayed my parents' faces from that evening. Not angry, not emotional, just resolved. I tried to remember if there had been signs, earlier moments I'd dismissed as nothing, because acknowledging them would have required me to change how I saw my family. I wondered how long the decision had been forming, how many conversations I'd never been part of. The hardest part wasn't the fear or the hunger. It was the erosion of certainty. I began to doubt my own memories, my own instincts. I questioned whether I had missed something obvious, whether my silence over the years had somehow invited this outcome. I knew logically that I hadn't taken the money, but logic felt fragile when everything else had already been stripped away. One night, parked beneath a flickering streetlight, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror and barely recognized myself. My face looked older, thinner, taut in places I hadn't noticed before. I stared at it for a long time, trying to locate the person I'd been before all of this, the one who believed that being good would be enough. That was when it occurred to me that no one was coming to fix this. That waiting quietly, the way I always had, wasn't going to restore anything. If I wanted the truth to matter, I would have to go looking for it myself. I didn't decide to investigate because I wanted revenge. At that point, revenge felt abstract, something that belonged to people who still had leverage. I started looking because uncertainty had become unbearable. I needed to know whether there was something concrete beneath the accusations, or whether my life had been dismantled on nothing more than convenience. The first thing I did was recover what little digital access I still had. I replaced my phone with a prepaid one and spent an afternoon at the library resetting passwords, requesting account histories, pulling whatever records hadn't been fully locked behind institutional walls. It was slow, methodical work. I forced myself to move carefully, not because I was afraid of what I'd find, but because I was afraid of hoping too much. I started with email. I searched for bank notifications, login alerts, anything time-stamped around the period my father claimed the withdrawals had occurred. At first, it was overwhelming months of automated messages statements I'd never bothered to read closely because they had never involved me directly. But as I narrowed, the window patterns began to emerge. On the days the largest withdrawals were made, I was at work. Not vaguely at work. I had calendar invites, meeting logs, emails sent within minutes of the transactions. I pulled them up side by side, my hands steady in a way that surprised me. I wasn't trying to convince anyone else yet. I was trying to convince myself that my memory hadn't betrayed me. Then there were the login records. The bank had flagged access from a desktop computer one registered as a trusted device years earlier. The IP address resolved to a residential network in my parents' neighborhood, not just the same city, the same block. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, rereading the numbers until they stopped blurring together. I didn't own a desktop computer. I had never logged into their accounts from home. I had never been given the credentials. My father had always handled finances personally. That had been a point of pride for him. The next detail felt almost insulting in its carelessness. The signature on the withdrawal authorization forms was clumsy. Not forged by someone practiced or cautious, but by someone imitating a shape they'd seen often enough to believe accuracy didn't matter. The slant was wrong, the spacing uneven. I compared it to older documents I found online, records my father had filed years ago when his business was first registered. The difference was obvious. It wasn't my signature, but it wasn't my father's either. That was when the question shifted. If it wasn't me and it wasn't him, then someone else had access. Someone inside the house. Someone trusted enough to move freely to use his computer to believe the risk was minimal. I thought of Lena. Not immediately. Not dramatically. The thought arrived slowly, like something I'd been circling without admitting. I remembered how often she borrowed my parents' devices, how my father brushed it off when she forgot passwords or locked herself out of accounts, how my mother handled her mistakes with softness, explaining them away as stress or adjustment. I felt sick but not surprised. What unsettled me most was not the possibility that Lena had taken the money. It was how easily the blame had landed on me instead. How natural it had seemed to everyone involved. As if my role in the family had already been defined well enough that no further examination was required. I printed everything I could. Login records, email timestamps, IP resolutions. I organized them into a thin folder I kept under the passenger seat of my car. It wasn't proof yet, not the kind that would stand up to scrutiny, but it was enough to tell me one thing with certainty. I hadn't imagined this. There was something else too. Something I hadn't expected to feel. Anger came later. What arrived first was clarity. For the first time since the dinner, the story stopped shifting beneath my feet. The facts didn't change depending on who told them. They didn't require me to perform innocence or humility. They simply existed, indifferent to how inconvenient they were for the people who needed a different narrative. I sat in the car that night, the folder resting on my lap, and thought about my parents' faces again. About how composed they'd been. How ready. I wondered when they'd seen the same information and decided it didn't matter. When they'd chosen explanation over truth. The realization didn't break me. It steadied me. Because once you understand that someone has chosen you as the cost of preserving their own image, you stop asking what you could have done differently. You stop bargaining with silence. You start preparing. I didn't know yet how far this would go. I didn't know what it would cost me to pursue the truth openly. But for the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. And that was how I knew I was done waiting. The shift didn't happen all at once. It came in small, cumulative ways, subtle changes in how strangers looked at me, how conversations ended too quickly, how my presence seemed to invite judgment before I ever spoke. The story about me had moved beyond my family. It had settled into the world. I felt it most when I was alone. I parked in a grocery store lot one afternoon, counting change in my lap, deciding whether I could afford both food and gas. I was leaning forward focused when I heard someone behind me say my name. Not questioning, not unsure, certain. I turned and the woman's face tightened with recognition. Two others stood nearby watching. I didn't know them. But they knew me, or at least they knew the version of me that had been circulated. The thief. The daughter who stole from her parents. You should be ashamed, one of them said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. I tried to explain. I don't know why. Maybe some part of me still believed that reason could interrupt momentum, that facts spoken calmly could reverse a conclusion already reached. But my words landed poorly, tripping over themselves. The more I spoke, the more convinced they seemed. Someone shoved me. I stumbled backward, hitting the side of my car. The next moment's blurred hands, voices, the sharp shock of pain radiating up my arm as I fell. I remember the sound more than anything else. A dull crack followed by pressure that made it hard to breathe. They left before anyone intervened. I sat on the asphalt for several minutes, my arm cradled against my chest, staring at nothing. When I finally stood, the pain followed me in waves intense enough to make my vision narrow. I drove myself to the emergency room because there was no one else to call. The hospital was bright and efficient. The nurse asked what happened. I said I fell. It felt easier than explaining how quickly a lie can become permission. They set my arm, wrapped it, handed me paperwork and a bill that came to $14,600. I stared at the number longer than necessary, trying to understand how something abstract could be so heavy. That night, the rain started early. I drove aimlessly, my arm throbbing beneath the cast, my mind moving in tight circles. The folder of evidence sat on the passenger seat, its presence both reassuring and useless. Proof didn't stop pain. It didn't protect you from strangers who believed they were enforcing justice. I found myself on the bridge over the Cooper River without remembering the turn that brought me there. The water below was dark, moving steadily, indifferent to everything happening above it. Cars passed behind me, their headlights stretching into brief lines of light. I stood at the railing for a long time, my good hand gripping cold metal, my breath fogging in the damp air. I didn't feel dramatic. I felt exhausted. I thought about how easy it would be to stop explaining, to stop defending, to stop carrying a story no one wanted to hear. I imagined the quiet that would follow, the kind that doesn't ask anything of you. The idea didn't scare me the way I expected it to. It felt almost practical. If I disappeared, the narrative would stabilize. My parents would be spared further scrutiny. Lena would be spared consequences. People would shake their heads and say it was tragic but not complicated. A troubled daughter. A sad ending. Everyone would be relieved to stop wondering. That was the thought that finally unsettled me. Not fear of dying, but the realization that my absence would be convenient. I leaned forward slightly, testing the distance, when a voice behind me said, "Hey, don't." It wasn't commanding. It wasn't panicked. Just firm enough to interrupt. I turned and saw an older woman a few steps away. She stood with her hands in her jacket pockets, her posture relaxed but attentive. Her eyes stayed on my face, not my cast, not the railing. "I've seen that look before," she said. "You don't want to jump. You want the pain to stop." Something in her tone, matter-of-fact, unsentimental, cut through the fog in my head. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just stood there, suddenly aware of how cold I was. She introduced herself as Ruth Gallagher, a retired police officer, she said, as if it were incidental. She asked if I had somewhere safe to go. When I didn't answer, she nodded like she'd expected that. Ruth didn't lecture me. She didn't tell me things would get better. She offered me a ride and waited patient until I accepted. Her car smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. The radio played softly, something instrumental and unobtrusive. At her house, she made soup and handed me a blanket. She let me shower first, even though I insisted I was fine. She didn't ask for details until I was ready. When I finally told her everything haltingly out of order, she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You're not crazy. And you're not a criminal. You're the person everyone decided they could afford to lose." The words settled into place quietly, like something I'd known, but needed to hear out loud. That night, I slept on her couch. Deeply. Without dreaming. And for the first time since the dinner, I woke up believing I might survive what came next. Ruth's house was small and quiet, the kind of place that felt lived in without trying to impress anyone. Nothing matched exactly. Books were stacked where they'd been finished, not shelved for display. The furniture showed wear in honest places. It was the first space I'd been in for weeks that didn't feel temporary. She didn't rush me out in the morning. I woke to the smell of coffee and the low murmur of the radio from the kitchen. For a few seconds, I forgot where I was. Then the weight of my arm, the dull ache beneath the cast, brought everything back. I sat up slowly, bracing myself for the familiar panic. It didn't come. Ruth was at the table reading the paper. She looked up, nodded once, and said, "There's food when you're ready. No questions, no expectations." We ate quietly. Eggs, toast, sliced fruit. Normal things. Halfway through the meal, I realized my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the effort of staying composed. Ruth noticed without commenting. She slid the coffee closer to me and let the silence do its work. Later, she asked if I wanted help. Not what happened. Not why. Help. I told her about the folder in my car. The records, the IP address, the signatures that didn't match. I said it all flatly, like inventory. She listened, asked precise questions, the kind that came from years of separating emotion from evidence. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "Then we start by treating this like what it is," she said. "A financial crime. And a cover-up." She called someone she trusted, a lawyer named Daniel Moore. Not a favor. A referral. Ruth didn't frame it as rescue. She framed it as procedure. Daniel agreed to meet that afternoon. His office was unremarkable, clean, neutral, the kind of place designed to keep emotions from spilling onto the furniture. I handed him the folder with both hands, suddenly aware of how thin it was. He didn't react to its size. He flipped through the pages, carefully asking me to clarify timelines, access points, prior knowledge. When he looked up, his expression had shifted not to sympathy, but to focus. "This is enough to reopen the banking records," he said. "And enough to challenge the narrative that's been circulating." He didn't promise outcomes. He didn't say justice would be served. He outlined steps, requests, documentation, time. For the first time since everything collapsed, someone spoke to me as if I were credible by default. Over the next few weeks, Ruth's house became a place of quiet rebuilding. I stayed on the couch. I washed dishes. I folded laundry. I learned the rhythm of her mornings, the way she liked the windows cracked open even when it was cold. She never made me feel like a guest who needed to justify her stay. The investigation moved slowly. Banks do not rush to admit error. Institutions protect themselves first, but records accumulate when someone insists on them long enough. Login histories were expanded. Device access logs were pulled. The picture sharpened. It was Lena. The withdrawals had been made from my parents' home computer late at night during stretches when my father was traveling. The money moved in uneven amounts, large enough to matter, inconsistent enough to avoid immediate alarms. Credit card statements began to surface. Casino charges. High-end purchases that didn't align with her income. What surprised me wasn't the theft. It was the response. My parents had known early. Daniel confirmed it when we obtained internal emails between them and the bank, conversations that acknowledged a family matter and requested discretion. They had asked whether responsibility could be reassigned to another authorized contact, whether the narrative could be contained. When Daniel read that part aloud, I felt something settle inside me. Not rage, not grief, finality. They hadn't been mistaken. They hadn't been confused. They had evaluated the situation and chosen the solution that preserved their standing. Lena was vulnerable. I was expendable. Ruth watched me absorb the information without interruption. When I finally spoke, my voice sounded unfamiliar to me, steady, almost distant. They didn't protect her, I said. They protected themselves. Ruth nodded. And they taught you something important without meaning to. I asked what that was. That love, when it's conditional, isn't safety. It's leverage. I thought about that long after she went to bed. Weeks turned into months. I found part-time work through a temp agency that didn't ask many questions. I saved what I could. My arm healed slowly. The bruises faded. The damage I couldn't see took longer. Daniel prepared the case methodically. He didn't push for confrontation. He prepared for disclosure, for accountability that didn't depend on apology. Sometimes late at night, I imagined facing my parents again, not yelling, not pleading, just placing the truth between us and stepping back. The image didn't bring relief, but it brought clarity. I wasn't looking to be welcomed back. I was looking to be finished. One evening, as Ruth and I sat watching the news in companionable silence, she said, "When this comes out, they'll try to rewrite it again. Be ready for that." I nodded. I already was. Because the hardest part, the part where I questioned my own reality, was over. Whatever came next, I would meet it standing. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It surfaced in fragments, each one duller and heavier than the last, like pieces of something broken that no longer fit back together cleanly. Daniel called on a Thursday afternoon. His voice was neutral, controlled the way it always was when he was about to say something that would change the shape of things. He told me the bank had completed its internal review. The access logs were consistent. The withdrawals were traced. The account activity pointed to a single user profile Lena's operating from my parents' home network. There was no ambiguity left. He asked if I was sitting down. I told him I was. He said my parents had been aware of the findings for years, not recently, not after the damage was done, early enough to intervene, early enough to stop the narrative from forming. They hadn't. Instead, they had contacted the bank privately and asked about options, about discretion, about how to keep the matter from escalating. They framed it as concern for the family, for their reputation, for Lena's future. When the bank raised questions about accountability, my parents had offered an alternative explanation, one that redirected attention away from Lena and onto me. Daniel didn't speculate. He didn't editorialize. He read from documents, emails, memos, carefully worded requests that never explicitly named me, but narrowed the field until there was only one plausible conclusion: a responsible adult child, financially independent, already distant enough to absorb the fallout without destabilizing the household. When the call ended, I sat very still. I thought I would feel anger, or vindication, or relief. What I felt instead was a quiet, hollow understanding. This hadn't been an impulsive betrayal. It had been a calculated decision, revised and maintained over time. A strategy. Ruth found me an hour later sitting at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold. She didn't ask what happened. She waited until I spoke. "They knew," I said. The words sounded smaller than they should have. They always knew. She nodded once. That's usually the part that hurts the most. It reframed everything. The dinner, the microphone, the certainty in my father's voice, the way my mother had avoided my eyes. None of it had been confusion or panic. It had been preparation. They weren't discovering a crime. They were formalizing a version of events they'd already agreed on. I thought about Lena then, not as a child, not as my sister, but as the person she had become. Someone who had learned early and well that consequences were flexible when someone else could be positioned between her and them. Someone who had watched me step aside again and again and understood intuitively that I would do it one more time if necessary. I didn't excuse her, but I understood her. Understanding I was learning was not the same as forgiveness. Daniel laid out what would happen next. Disclosure, documentation, formal acknowledgement from the bank that the withdrawals were unauthorized by me. A correction of records. It would not be dramatic. It would not be loud. It would be definitive. It would also be public. Once the information was released, the story my parents had relied on would collapse. The question was not whether they would reach out, but how. They didn't make me wait long. My mother called first. Her voice sounded thinner than I remembered. She didn't apologize. She said my father was unwell, that the stress had been unbearable, that the family had been through so much. She said it would mean a lot if I could come home and talk. I asked her one question. When did you know it wasn't me? There was a pause, a small intake of breath, then silence long enough to become an answer. My father called the next day. He spoke about regret in general terms, about how situations get complicated, about how no one wins when families fall apart. He asked if we could meet somewhere neutral. He said he wanted to explain. I agreed. Not because I wanted an explanation, but because I wanted to close something cleanly. We met at a coffee shop near the courthouse, public enough to keep things restrained, familiar enough to avoid theatrics. They arrived together, sitting across from me like guests waiting to be received. My father looked older. My mother looked tired. Lena arrived late and took a seat slightly behind them, her eyes fixed on the floor. I placed the documents on the table, the IP logs, the bank findings, the signatures. I didn't introduce them. I didn't narrate. I let the silence do the work. My father's face drained of color. My mother reached for his hand without looking at me. Lena finally looked up, then, her expression crumpling, as if she were surprised that the past could still reach her. I didn't think it would go this far, she said quietly. I met her eyes for the first time in years. You thought it would end with me disappearing, I said. Not accusing, just stating. No one contradicted me. In that moment, something shifted, not in them but in me. The weight I had been carrying, the one shaped like unanswered questions, loosened its grip. I didn't need them to confess. The truth had already done its work. I stood gathering my things. This doesn't make us even, I said. It just makes things accurate. And for the first time since my name had been spoken into a microphone and turned into something else, accuracy was enough. 5 years passed without ceremony. Time didn't heal anything by itself, but it did create distance. Distance softened the edges of memory and hardened my sense of proportion. The urgency that once governed every thought loosened its grip. Life became quieter, not easier, but steadier, built from choices I made deliberately instead of reactions I barely survived. I changed cities. I changed routines. I learned how to live without bracing for the next explanation I might be forced to give. I heard about my parents' collapse the way you hear about storms after they've already moved on, through fragments secondhand, stripped of drama. My father lost his license. Clients withdrew quietly one by one. The house was sold under pressure. The social calendar that had once been meticulously maintained went blank. People who had believed the story about me believed the correction just as easily. Reputation, I learned, is only loyal to momentum. The call came from my mother on a Tuesday morning. Her voice sounded small, careful. She didn't say my name at first. She asked how I was doing, as if we'd spoken recently. She said they were struggling, that things had fallen apart faster than expected. That family should be there for each other when everything else fails. I listened without interrupting. When she finally asked if I would meet them, I said yes. Not because I wanted reconciliation, because I wanted to see whether anything had changed besides their circumstances. We chose a cafe halfway between where we lived now, neutral ground, practical, forgettable. I arrived early and took a seat near the window. When they walked in, I recognized them immediately, and not at all. Age had done its quiet work. So had consequence. My father looked diminished in a way that had nothing to do with posture. The certainty that once carried him seemed to have drained away, replaced by something tentative. My mother clutched her purse in her lap, her movements careful as if she were afraid of making the wrong gesture. Lena sat slightly apart, her shoulders rounded inward, her attention flicking between us like she was waiting for permission to exist. We exchanged brief greetings. Polite, measured. The kind people use when they don't know which version of the past is allowed in the room. I didn't bring up the anniversary dinner. I didn't recount what followed. I didn't need to. Instead, I placed a thin folder on the table between us and slid it forward. Inside were the same documents Daniel had prepared years earlier. IP logs, bank confirmations, signatures analyzed and verified. The official acknowledgement that I had not taken $1, that the withdrawals had been unauthorized, that the record had been corrected. My father opened the folder and stared at it as if it might accuse him out loud. My mother pressed her lips together, nodding slowly as if recognition might substitute for apology. Lena spoke first. "I didn't think it would end like this," she said. Her voice trembled, but it didn't break. "I thought you'd move on. I thought it would just fade." I watched her carefully. Not with anger, with curiosity. "You thought I'd disappear?" I said. "Because that's what always worked before." She didn't deny it. My father cleared his throat. He talked about fear, about panic, about making the best decision with limited information. He said he had believed at the time that sacrificing one relationship could save the rest of the family. He said he hadn't anticipated the fallout. I waited until he finished. "You didn't miscalculate," I said. "You prioritized." The word landed heavily precise in a way nothing else could have been. My mother reached for my hand, then stopping short when I didn't move. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She asked if there was anything they could do now. Anything to make amends. Anything to help me get back on my feet. I thought about Ruth, about Daniel, about the nights I'd slept in my car, about the years it took to trust my own memory again. "I don't need help," I said. "And I don't need repair." That was when I realized how differently we were measuring the moment. They were looking for forgiveness as a transaction, a way to rebalance something they believed could still be negotiated. I was there to define an ending. "I'm not cutting you off to punish you," I said. "I'm stepping away because contact with you costs me more than it gives." Lena began to cry, then quietly embarrassed as if she hadn't planned to. I didn't comfort her. I didn't accuse her either. I told her I forgave her for myself, not for her. That forgiveness didn't mean access. It meant I wasn't carrying her choices anymore. I stood gathering my coat. My father asked if this was goodbye. "It's clarity," I said. "Goodbyes imply something unresolved." Outside, the air felt sharper than it had when I arrived. I walked to my car without looking back. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was leaving something unfinished behind me. I felt like I was choosing what stayed. I didn't feel lighter after that meeting. What I felt was quieter. Closure, I learned, doesn't arrive as relief. It arrives as the absence of noise. The constant internal rehearsal stopped. The imagined conversations I'd been having for years went silent. There was no longer a version of the past demanding correction every time I stood still. I stopped checking for messages that wouldn't come. I stopped explaining myself to people who hadn't asked. I stopped waiting for my parents to understand something they had already decided to misunderstand when it suited them. Life continued not as a reward, but as a consequence of choosing myself. I built my days carefully at first. Routine became scaffolding. I opened a small design studio in a shared workspace. Nothing flashy, clean lines, functional projects, clients who valued clarity over spectacle. I liked the predictability of it, the way effort translated directly into outcome. There was no hidden ledger, no unspoken hierarchy. I met Lucas through work. He didn't ask questions the way people used to, circling my history as if it were a puzzle he might solve. When I told him pieces of it, he listened without interrupting or reframing. He didn't try to fix the story. He accepted it as context, not definition. We moved in together slowly. No grand gestures, no promises made in response to fear. Just decisions made and kept. When I found out I was pregnant, the news didn't feel cinematic. It felt grounding, like a future had quietly taken a seat beside me without demanding proof of worthiness. I thought briefly about telling my parents, about the symmetry of it. Then I recognized the impulse for what it was: habit, not need. I didn't reach out. Forgiveness had already done its work. It had released me from carrying resentment forward. It had not obligated me to reopen doors that had once been used to push me out. People sometimes ask if I miss them. The question always sounds the same no matter who asks, as if missing is the natural endpoint of separation. I answer honestly. I miss the idea of parents I never had. I miss the version of family I worked so hard to preserve by disappearing. I don't miss the cost of belonging to people who required my silence to maintain their comfort. There are moments, small, ordinary ones, when the past brushes close. A holiday dinner. A form that asks for emergency contacts. A story someone tells casually about their mother calling too much. Those moments don't hurt the way they used to. They pass through me, acknowledged and released. What remains is discernment. I know now how easily authority can be mistaken for truth, how quickly reputation can replace evidence, how family loyalty, when weaponized, becomes a tool for erasure rather than protection. I also know what it feels like to be believed without condition, to be helped without being evaluated for usefulness, to stand in a room and trust that my presence is not provisional. Ruth still checks in. Daniel sends the occasional update about cases that remind him of mine. I keep the folder of documents in a locked drawer, not because I need it, but because it reminds me of the moment I stopped questioning my own reality. Sometimes late at night, I think about the girl I was before all of this, the one who believed endurance was proof of love. I don't judge her. She survived with the tools she had, but I don't live by her rules anymore. Family, I've learned, is not defined by who claims you when it's convenient. It's defined by who refuses to trade your well-being for their image. It's defined by who stands still when the story turns against you. I didn't need my parents to admit what they did. I needed them to lose the power to define me. That power is gone now. I don't speak about them with bitterness. I don't warn others. I don't seek validation. I live openly, carefully, without the instinct to preempt blame. That more than anything feels like freedom. My life is not an act of defiance. It is an act of alignment. I don't need them to understand that. I only need them to no longer have the ability to hurt me. There is a kind of pain that doesn't come from cruelty, but from calculation. From the moment someone decides that your suffering is acceptable collateral for their comfort. That kind of wound doesn't announce itself loudly. It teaches you to doubt your instincts, to explain yourself too much, to accept less than you deserve, because you've been trained to believe that harmony matters more than truth. What I learned slowly, imperfectly, is that survival is not the same as living. You can endure a situation for years and still be fundamentally unsafe inside it. You can forgive and still choose distance. You can understand someone's reasons without agreeing to keep paying the price for them. Walking away didn't make me stronger overnight. It made me honest. Honest about what cost too much. Honest about what I was no longer willing to trade away just to keep a role I never agreed to play. If this story resonated with you, if you recognized yourself in the silences, the justifications, the quiet unraveling, I'd like to hear from you. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Your presence here matters more than you know. And if you found value in spending this time with me, consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. Thank you for listening carefully. Thank you for staying.